Tech for Tech. In this video, I am reviewing the Lumix S5 camera as far as time-lapse photography goes. I was loaned this very kindly by the team at Lumix UK, and since they sent it to me about 4 weeks ago, I've shot 25,000 photos with it, and I'm going to be sharing with you my findings. Let's go. Hello, my name is Vandeputte. I'm a time-lapse photographer living in London, channel about time-lapse travel and tutorials. A quick reminder before we begin that Patreon supporters and YouTube channel members get access to raw files and other downloads and early access to all of my content. Check the button down below. You can sign up to become a member starting at £1 or $1 a month, which is fantastic. Now, as always, there are so many reviewers out there who talk about cameras and their performance as far as photography and videography and cinematography, etc. I am a time-lapse photographer. That's what I'm known for, that's what I'm really good at, and that's what I'm going to be talking about only in this video. So let's begin with the specifications of the S5 that are relevant to time-lapse photography. So, the S5 is a full-frame L-mount mirrorless camera. It has a 24.1 megapixel CMOS sensor and it produces JPEG, RAW or HLG photos. It features dual SD card slots and can be charged via USB-C PD while shooting. It holds a 2200 mAh or milliamp hour battery, which is rated according to the manual for 440 photos. Now keep watching because that is not true at all. It has a 3-inch free-angle TFT LCD screen on the back and a viewfinder which consists of an OLED screen featuring 2.36 million pixels. The camera features contrast autofocus which works all the way down to -6 EV. The ISO ranges from 50 to 51,200 and is expandable to 204,800, and it's got dual native ISO at 100 and 640. The sensor stabilizes on 5 different axes, which is fantastic if you're into hyperlapse photography like myself and you shoot a lot of handheld hyperlapses. Shutter speeds for photos range from 60 seconds all the way down to 1/8,000th of a second, and in movie mode it goes all the way down to 1/16,000th of a second. On the side it features a 2.5mm jack input for remotes. However, there is an issue with this thing and I will talk more about that later. The S5 can shoot a sequence of RAW or JPEG stills using the built-in intervalometer, and it can then render in-camera a high-resolution video file with multiple resolution options and playback frame rate options. Absolutely fantastic. It's got Wi-Fi and Bluetooth built in, and the body is dust and splash resistant. That body by itself weighs 630 grams, and that is about enough for the specifications. Let's move on into the other chapters. Quick spoiler. I bloody love this camera. It is the near perfect time-lapse camera. Now, let's find out why that is. There are 3 different ways that you can shoot a time-lapse with the S5. Let's talk about time-lapse photo mode first. So, you power the camera on, obviously, make sure there's a battery and a card and a lens, etc. And then you switch to the dedicated time-lapse mode on the mode dial. Choose time-lapse shot and select whether you want to shoot with an interval. If you turn the interval on, you can select the interval later. If you turn it off, the camera will just shoot as fast as it can. It hasn't been super consistent in my testing, but it appears to be between 0.3 and 0.7 seconds in between photos. So if you are looking to expose for as long as possible with a fast interval, this might be your best bet at getting nice, exposure trails, etc. in your shot. When you do choose to shoot with an interval, you can set your minimum interval to be 1 second, all the way up to 99 minutes and 59 seconds. You can go from 0 photos all the way to 9,999 photos, and if you combine these two at the extremes, the longest possible time-lapse that you can shoot with the S5 is just over 694 days, which is quite a while. I don't think there's too many things you can shoot with that. Maybe construction, maybe that's something useful, but even then you probably use some dedicated hardware for that. Something I really like about setting up in this menu is that it shows you the end time of the shot, which has been very useful to figure out if I'm shooting long enough for a sunrise, etc. It's these little things that are built in that tell me that the developers behind this camera system really pay attention to what a time-lapse photographer needs. You can choose to start your time-lapse now when you hit the shutter button, or you can set a time in the future, which is fantastic, and it's actually how I shot literally every single sunrise time-lapse on the S1 and on the S5 for the Cloud Palace that you may or may not have seen on my channel recently. And then you have the option to turn on or off exposure leveling. And what exposure leveling does is it looks at what you're shooting in your time lapse and it will gradually adjust the settings that will fix the changing in light for a sunset or a sunrise. My preferred way of shooting holy grails with this camera is to flick it to aperture priority mode, set the ISO to auto. Because it's on aperture priority, the aperture will stay locked and it will start changing the shutter speed and the ISO. If you set your max auto ISO to something like 1600 or 3200, you will get a relatively clean file and you will start ramping your shutter speed. Now, the one thing that I have noticed here that I didn't notice in my S1 review is that the maximum shutter speed, or the minimum shutter speed, depends on how you look at it, is 1 second in aperture priority mode. That works for cityscapes and stuff like that, but if you want to go, for example, from a daytime shot all the way to a Milky Way shot, 1 second is not long enough for an exposure for a Milky Way, so keep that in mind when you're using this camera to do extreme holy grail shots. Then let's quickly loop back to the top of that menu where you can select stop motion mode as well. I recently used this mode for an ad campaign for a big alcohol brand that is now being played on bus stops in Europe, which is pretty cool and maybe something for a future video. But pretty much in this mode, you take a photo, or you can shoot with an interval as well, but you take a photo and then it gives an low opacity overlay of your previous shot on top of the viewfinder. So if you're animating something, that is extremely useful and something you will find in advanced stop motion software where you can have those overlays to help you figure out how to do stuff consistently. Then the second way to shoot time lapses with the S5 is in S&Q mode, or slow and quick mode, which is also its own dedicated mode. Pretty much what this does, instead of shooting photos, it shoots video frames, but at different intervals. And the intervals range from 1 second to 2 seconds, 5, 10, 15, 30, and 60. Funnily enough, not 25 and 50. Maybe that's an oversight, you know, PAL versus NTSC. The way I would use this mode is for very niche stuff. Honestly, I haven't actually used it at the time of recording this. So if you have any suggestions on how you would use S&Q mode, let me know. Just off the top of my head, I think it would be very useful for shooting, for example, something that resembles a tilt shift scene where you give the impression that something is a miniature. You want to shoot those things with an interval that is less than 1 second. And as you know, the built-in interval is only 1 second. So if you want to have more frames per second, you can go into S&Q mode and shoot a 4K video and then make it look like a miniature. I've got a video about how to do that somewhere up there. Maybe that's something fun to play with in the future. Then the third way to shoot time lapses with the Lumix camera is the 2.5mm input jack port on the side, which takes, you know, signals from a remote like this. This is the LR Timelapse Pro Timer version 3. The thing here is I've got plenty of cables. They're all the same style cable, but a normal cable won't work with the S5. It'll trigger a video recording as opposed to a photo that gets shuttered, that gets triggered. So I've had to buy a separate cable specifically for the Lumix system, which has an extra ring on that jack input. I haven't been able to test it, but I'll put it on screen right now. If it works or not, I had to spend 10 quid just to find out if it worked. So yeah, that's something I would change. I think it's just a firmware thing. If you're in time-lapse mode and the camera gets an input from a thing via the remote input, don't start video, start shooting photos, right? That being said, every single time-lapse I've recorded on the S5 and the S1 has been using the built-in intervalometer, so who needs a remote for that? I guess it's useful if you want to do advanced stuff. For example, interval ramping, which is what you can do with this remote. I'm making a separate video about that very soon, so subscribe if you haven't already. Dynamic range, something that people freak out about and lose their shit about all the time. I am far from the best person to talk about how to test dynamic range, and I don't have any of the charts or whatever. All I can share about this is just like with the R6. I haven't found any limitations in the performance of this sensor, and I think if you look at any of the sensors that have come out in the last year or maybe even last 2 years, if you can't make it work with that, you need to work on your own skills, because they're all pretty damn good. Here are some photos that are over or underexposed or properly exposed photos in which I'm pushing and pulling the highlights and the shadows, and as you can see, yes, there's a little bit of noise, but there's quite a lot of information you can push and pull back. And once again, I just made the Cloud Palace and everyone bloody loved that, and the majority of those shots were recorded without graduated ND filters, etc. Just raw files that I pushed and pulled in the highlights and the shadows regions, and you know, it all works out pretty damn well. So dynamic range, I think it's good. Resolution. This camera features 6,000 pixels on the long end and 4,000 pixels on the tall end, or the short end, I guess, which results in 24 megapixels. And I really like this resolution. It's just that tad more that I missed in the Canon R6. Gives you plenty of room to stabilize, to crop in for 4K videos, and you can make 6K video files out of this series of raw photos that you're going to be shooting with it. So, pretty ideal for me. The S5 has decent ergonomics. It is much better than the S1 as far as buttons and usability goes. It's a lot more lightweight and it feels sturdy still. The S1, in my opinion, is too big and too bulky, and some of the buttons feel a bit off. That being said, it is still not as snappy, or the quality is still a bit different when you compare it to a Canon camera in the equivalent camera range. Low light is another one of those things that I'm not a pro at testing at, but again, I haven't really been disappointed by this at all. Here are some photos zoomed in at different ISO levels where you can see the noise straight out of camera. Very comfortable to use this up to 6400 ISO. Anything higher than that in a sequence of photos that you get rendered into a video file, you're going to have to apply some noise reduction, for which I highly recommend Neat Video. But yeah, the low light performance on these cameras I think is, pretty damn good. It's not a Sony a7S III, but then again, that camera only has half the pixels. Those pixels are probably twice as big, so they collect more light. So I think it's decent low light performance, this one. The S5 features 2 SD card slots. One is rated for both UHS 1 and UHS 2, and the other one is only rated for UHS 1. I hate SD cards. They always break, but they're cheap, and everyone has SD cards, and I've forgotten an SD card and I've been able to borrow one from someone else. That's not the case with XQD cards or CF Express or CFast cards. So SD cards, there's good and bad things about them. I actually don't mind that it's got 2 SD ports, even though I have some SD cards that I just need to buy new ones because all the plastic freaking little bits break off and it's annoying, and then it tells me that I've got the card write protect switch on when I haven't. It's just annoying. That being said, it's nice to have 2 card slots in there for sure. Now, quick intermezzo word from the sponsor. The sponsor is me, or it's you, depending on how you look at it. I have written an ebook almost a year ago. We're coming up to a year now. It's called Passive Income for Creatives. It teaches you a framework, a system that you can apply to your own hobby, to your own passion, be it photography or ice skating or knitting or vegan baking or Italian cuisine or you name it, sustainable travel, cars, everything. As long as you're knowledgeable about, as long as you are knowledgeable about something and you can provide people with value, this book teaches you how to make money using your knowledge, using your passion. It only has 5-star reviews. It has helped change people's careers. It teaches you how to stop trading your precious finite time for money and to create something that's scalable with which you can make money while you sleep. That whole BS that everyone's talking about. But yes, literally, it teaches you how to set up a passive income system using your hobby. It also features a chapter on how to create an authentic and organic following on social media based on a couple of pillars, which is what I've been using over the last couple of years. And, I've got some followers, so I feel like it works, but maybe not. Who knows? Anyways, up to you to find out. Back to the video now. Weather sealing. It is said to be dust and splash resistant. I don't know what that means. I don't know if there's like a scale that you measure that on. All I can say is that it has been rained on and it has fogged up, and I've brought it inside from outdoors when it was cold and almost at freezing point, and it totally fogged up. Took the lens off, which I shouldn't have done, and everything was fogging up on the inside as well. I just let it air out and it's flawless. It's perfect. I think this is some great splash sealing or rain sealing. I wouldn't dunk it underwater, but I think you can get away with a quick splash in a puddle maybe. Who knows? I would say this is very satisfactory weather sealing. Now, one of the key things when it comes to time-lapse cameras, the battery life. As I mentioned earlier, it is rated to shoot 440 photos, which is mind-blowingly little based on that 2200 mAh battery. Now, I think those numbers are always based on being out and about and shooting and walking around, and the stabilization turns off and on and off and on when you're shooting, you power on and you're shooting photos and this and that. When you're shooting a time-lapse, it is different. You put the camera on a tripod, you disable everything, noise reduction, vibration reduction, stabilization, all that. You disable it all and you just let it shoot a photo every couple of seconds. What's that noise even? That's not even a shutter. Maybe, I don't know, it doesn't matter. I managed to get probably on average around 1300 raw photos out of one full battery charge, and I tested this a bunch. You have the results on screen right now, and all of this was in very cold conditions as sunrises while the camera had been sitting statically outside for the entire night before it started shooting. So based on the 440 photo estimate, this is quite nice. Like, I'm quite impressed with that. The best thing though is the fact that we can charge via USB-C from a normal phone battery power bank or via USB-C power delivery PD, which I have in this anchor brick, and that just powers the camera indefinitely. That's how I shot the 24-hour time-lapse on, I can't remember if it's the S1 or the S5, but yeah, you can shoot indefinitely if you have a big enough battery, and that's just fantastic. But yeah, the battery is rated for 440, and I got on average maybe 1300 photos per charge, which isn't great compared to DSLRs, but keep in mind this is a mirrorless and it has constantly, you know, the sensor that is reading what is hitting the screen, where with a DSLR, nothing is actively constantly getting read out as far as light or metering goes, so pretty good. A couple other fun things related to the battery. I noticed it took about an hour to charge to half the capacity, I guess, over USB-C PD. And this might be useful for some. If you put the battery in the charger, even if it's disconnected, it gives you a quick little readout of what level the battery is at. Now, one thing that I would change, that I tried to change in the menus and I couldn't find it, and it's a big difference between the S1 and the S5. The S1 shows you the percentage of the battery, whereas the S5 only has these little bars. And that's not enough for me. I need to know the percentage specifically of this battery so I can figure out how many more photos I can shoot, or how many photos used up how much battery. Like, it's such a small little thing, but I noticed it immediately, that difference, and I couldn't figure out how to turn on a percentage versus the little bars. I hope we can fix that in a future firmware upgrade, because yeah, I do miss those percentages. This is one of my absolute favorite features of the Lumix systems. It's the rendering in camera. You can have a JPEG sequence or a RAW sequence, not a HLG sequence, by the way, and you can render that in camera. Hit the play menu, go to time-lapse sequence, and then select the sequence that you want to render, and you get a multitude of options as far as resolutions go, frame rates, and playback frame rates as well, and you can even select to render it backwards, which might be useful, for example, for a stop motion sequence. This is one of the key things that make me love this camera system so much for time-lapse photographers. I use it all the time to render a quick full HD preview of a sequence that I just shot, about 3 minutes of rendering for 1000 frames, raw frames for full HD at 25 frames per second, which is pretty good. And you can render in 4K and then quickly share that on social media if if you're out and about, you don't have your computer. I've done that before and no one's ever commented about the quality or the lack of bitrate or whatever. It just looks fantastic, as long, obviously, as you're shooting good stuff. Oh, and it even allows you to choose 8 or 10-bit for that video file. Pretty cool, right? Are there any bugs that I have found? Yes, I consider that battery thing a bug. No, it's not really a bug, but I just really missed that percentage. Then there has been a inconsistent interval when shooting with a 10-second interval with the power saving mode turned on. It went from 10 to 20 to 30, it skipped a couple of beats, so if you're shooting time lapses, do some proper testing before you turn on that power saving mode, because I have found it to kind of bug up the sequence that I was trying to shoot, and sadly it was quite a nice sunrise that got ruined by that, and that is why I'm out here testing cameras, to let you know what to do and what not to do. What would I change about this camera? Couple things, and I've probably mentioned all of them in the video already. That 2.5mm input port, I would make sure that triggers photos. This honestly feels like a very simple firmware fix, right? I would also change the maximum or minimum, depending on how you look at it, shutter speed in aperture priority mode from 1 second to 30 seconds, so we can ramp from daytime all the way to a nice crispy Astro Milky Way shot. Again, that's something I didn't realize when I was making my S1 review, and I got that input from, I think, Michael from London Viewpoints, who asked me, what is the shutter speed in aperture priority mode? And yeah, you can set it just like on the Canons, but it tops out at 1 second. So that's, again, I think, an easy firmware fix. Something that the Sony cameras do is they allow you to choose how fast the camera ramps its exposure. The Lumix only has the one mode. It does a pretty good job, but in certain situations you want to have the option to ramp fast or slow. And that's pretty much it. There's not much I would change about this camera. I feel like you've noticed by now, I'm a big fan of the S5. Alright, and now we're at the conclusion. Here's my conclusion. The S5 is a fantastic, almost perfect time-lapse camera. It is the camera I thought the S1 was going to be when I got it, but I have the S5 now, and I see no reason to keep my S1. I actually asked Lumix if I can keep the S5, and they're like, no, but we can talk about it in the future. So maybe I will be adding the S5 to my time-lapse kit. It ticks nearly all the boxes, and in my opinion, it is one of the best time-lapse cameras on the market right now. There's one final thing I wanted to add to this, and it's big props to Lumix for adding functional firmware upgrades to your lineup, or for improving the firmware of all your cameras. The S1 has now been out for a while, and I recently updated the firmware, and I got a bunch of new options as well. There's like raw video coming out of the HDMI now, and there's extra photo and video options, and other brands just don't do those big firmware upgrades the way Lumix does, and I'm very, very happy about that. And half the reason I make these kinds of videos is to give brands feedback on what they are putting in their cameras and how they can change it in the future, or maybe how they can change their existing lineups. So with these bugs or these things that I would change about the S5, maybe Lumix can take that on board and make the camera even better, because once again, the S5, in my opinion, is currently one of the best time-lapse cameras on the market. It's clearly time to finish this video because it's Friday afternoon here and I'm hot and I've got more videos to film. Remember to check out my ebook Passive Income for Creatives. There's a discount code below, or you can sign up to my newsletter and get a nice discount as well. I don't even know what I was going to say at the end here. Yeah, thanks for watching. I hope you're well. Let me know. Just leave a comment. Honestly, any comment helps to, you know, with the algorithm and shit like that. You know what it is. Cheers. I'll see you in the next video.